Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Middle East Institute. My name is Fanar Haddad. I'm a senior research fellow here. It's my honor to host this joint event with RSIS, between MEI and RSIS. And we have three speakers today. On my left is Emmanuel Karagiannis. Is that a correct? There you go. Associate Professor Karagiannis is Associate Professor at the Department of Defense Studies of King's College London. He has been published widely, and he has a new book, The New Political Islam, Human Rights, Democracy, and Justice, which has just been published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. We also have from the University of Exeter, Enrica Fei, who is currently based at the Department of Arab and Islamic Studies, where she is a PhD fellow working on transnational Shia networks in the Middle East. And finally, closer to home, we have Nawab, Mohamed Nawab Osman. He is the coordinator of the Malaysia program at the S.Rajaratnam School of International Studies, NTU. Of course, very widely published. Most recently, he has a new book by the title of Hizb al-Tahrir, Indonesia, Identity, Ideology, and Religio-Political Mobilization. And that was published by Routledge earlier in the year. And I should mention that there's a book talk. Nawab will be giving a book talk tomorrow at the RSIS at 3 p.m. Is that 3:30 p.m. tomorrow? Okay, so I was told to basically build on the work of my good friend Emmanuel Karagiannis, who, I have to say, we started quite a long way before he finished his work on Hizb ut-Tahrir in Central Asia at about the same time when I was doing my work on Indonesia, and he's been very kind in terms of sharing his expertise and I would say reviews and so on of things that I've written in the past on Hizb ut-Tahrir, so I'm thankful for it. And what I'm doing today is to actually look at precisely what he has written in his book, building upon this idea of the human rights frame and Hizb ut-Tahrir. Now, just for the sake of most of us in this room, I suspect, that might not be familiar with Hizb ut-Tahrir, I'm just going to go a little bit into details about the movement itself. It was founded in 1951, by this man in this photo, Taqiyuddin Andabhani. Andabhani came from a very esteemed family of Muslim religious scholars, perhaps unlike many of the other Islamists that tend to come from professional background, people like Hassan al-Banna, who comes from who's a school teacher, or Maududi, who was a journalist. Andabhani was actually trained in Al-Azhar in Cairo. And he also came from a family of esteemed religious scholars. His grandfather, for people who might be familiar with Islamic studies, Yusuf Andabhani, who was a scholar working within the Ottoman religious bureaucracy, and also very Sufi-oriented, which also explains why Hizb ut-Tahrir, for instance, unlike many other Islamist groups, Sunni Islamist groups, if I may add, is very highly tolerant of Sufi or traditionalist practices, which in many cases, such as in the case of Indonesia, which I've done most of my work in, or even Malaysia, have been advantageous to them in terms of spreading their message. It was my reading, and that I believe of him and at least another scholar, is that the movement itself was born not necessarily with the idea of to be a transnational movement. It was born out of the experience of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It was Andabhani and his family suffered quite a bit as a result of what happened to Palestine. And his reaction was really to address the issue of British colonialism and the Arab-Israeli conflict at that point of time. But as a result of the movement being banned in many of the Middle Eastern countries, it became transnational, and in a lot of ways by accident. Many of its leaders in the Middle East were forced out of the Middle East, and they took refuge in the West, in particular Germany, Australia, and the UK, and used those countries as a base for them to subsequently spread the movement even further apart. So, for example,
the Hizb ut-Tahrir in South Asia, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, were all founded by British-born Pakistanis, Indians, and Bangladeshis. The same with places like Mauritius. In the case of Indonesia, it was founded by a man who was Australian by citizenship in the country, who I met and did an interview with. The other person who met him, I believe, very early on, before I did, is Professor Martin van Brunissen, and he was again kind enough to share his notes with me. The movement grew to, basically the objective of the movement is to revive the Islamic Caliphate. Its methodology of doing so, it claims that they claim to follow the methodology of the Prophet. They essentially have a three-step process. The first being to build a community of people who would actually spread the ideas, or who would form the core of the movement. They then preach the ideas to the public, and they seek what is known as nusra, or support from other actors, important actors within society, essentially to stage a peaceful coup d'etat. But again, as we would later observe, the attitude of Hizb ut-Tahrir with regards to violence and tolerance is something that is perhaps needs to be questioned. I'm not going to go into too much details about this because Emmanuel already covered it, and I'm building some of this discussion around themes in his book. But just to perhaps build on the three strands of the human rights frame employed by Islamist activists, I think the question of tolerance, this is something again from his book, Secularism and Citizenship Rights, often feature very prominently in the discourse of groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir. I remembered, for instance, in Australia, when I met members of Hizb ut-Tahrir Australia, the argument that they put forth against racism, against or Islamophobia against the Australian Muslim community was to argue that they came to Australia, they paid for their flight to Australia, to make the case as if all white Australians came as criminals into Australia. So this is the kind of messaging that you will find, or the frames in which they build upon the movement itself. Now, I think Emmanuel's chapter looking at the Hizb ut-Tahrir really focused mostly on the Hizb ut-Tahrir in the Western context, and I want to build on that. And rather than disagree, I think I agree with him, but perhaps I would nuance the argument slightly to argue that this human rights frame, the master frame of human rights, is often employed in two types of political systems: open political systems and closed political systems. So in open political systems, we find that Hizb ut-Tahrir would sought the protection of rights of Muslims, not only those who are born in the country that they're born in, but also in other contexts. So the photo that he had of Hizb ut-Tahrir protesting outside the Uzbek embassy, for example, would be one such example of how they try to clamor for the rights of Muslims. Now, in a number of contexts, Hizb ut-Tahrir has been banned. In some other contexts, such as Germany, which is a very unique context, Hizb ut-Tahrir in Germany is often being described as being banned. Actually, it's not banned. They are only as a Hizb ut-Tahrir can exist as a political, as an organization, but they are banned from organizing public activities, which I think is one of the most effective ways to deal with the problem of Hizb ut-Tahrir, rather than banning it, because you do not create martyrs out of them, but at the same time, you decripple them because they can't organize activities. So what members of Hizb ut-Tahrir Germany tried to do was they went to the European Court of Justice, arguing essentially for their rights to exist as an organization. And this is basically an example of how the movement used essentially the master frame of human rights. In Australia, as I mentioned, Muslim minority issues are often used to, again, try to clamor for, more human rights for Muslims within the country. Now, in closed political system, we have seen that often Hizb ut-Tahrir would employ the strategy, again, the master frame of human rights, to essentially argue that the human rights of its members should be respected. Now, Central Asia, which Emmanuel has done his work on Hizb ut-Tahrir the most in, has one of the worst records of human rights abuses in the world. And what's interesting is, I mean, an example of this would be how the President Islam Karimov's government basically boiled members of Hizb ut-Tahrir to death, and you can find gory photos of this being put up online. And it is then being argued that the basic human rights of existence, human existence, or political freedom or political expression is not respected. And you can see, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir often in the context of Central Asia highlighting reports by Amnesty International and other human rights organizations, and work very closely with them in trying to advocate for their case. Now, what I'm saying, building on this, is that in hybrid system, and I think I would consider Malaysia, even after the regime change, still as a hybrid system of governance. Of course, one other example that's often being cited is where we are right now here, Singapore. What I mean by this is that you actually have basically tenets of the democratic system, such as an open and free election. But at the same time, there are many impediments within society, such as the freedom to express, complete freedom of political expression are not quite, is not quite respected. Now, in these cases, I personally argue that human rights is often not a master frame that is employed. In fact, more often than not, they would argue, in the case of Malaysia, against human rights of, different groups of people. And I have 3 examples here of how this is employed. So first is a very famous issue in Malaysia with regards to the usage of the word Allah. For Emmanuel and Enrica, this might seem like an oxymoron, but in Malaysia, it is basically banned for non-Muslims to use the word Allah to describe God. Allah is considered an exclusively Muslim term, so it refers to a Muslim God somehow. And Hizb ut-Tahrir has been very strong in advocating that essentially Christians do not have the right to use the word Allah, and have expressed themselves in various calls. They have also called for liberal Muslims, people who do not subscribe, the people who promote more values of democracy, more open system and so on, to be suppressed, that they should be imprisoned. And their stance against the LGBT community is perhaps one of the most interesting ones, because they basically said in their future Islamic state, all these people would be stoned to death. Right? And they openly write about this and advocate for that to happen. Now, to sum up, because I think I might have 1 minute.
No, you got 5 minutes.
Oh, really? I'm in a rush. Okay, but the larger point I think that needs to be made here is that human rights as a frame of mobilization and tool of defense is employed. The master frame of human rights is employed in defense of the rights of members of Hizb ut-Tahrir and whoever they deem as oppressed Muslim. However, they sought as a group to limit the human rights of any other group deemed to be a threat to Islam. And at the same time, when you look at what is interesting perhaps about groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, is this difficult confluence that I would argue between what they are seeking to achieve and what they are actually, the messaging that they are they are putting forward. So they sought to establish a caliphate, which from their own writings suggests a totalitarian state that undermines the human rights of not just non-Muslims, but also Muslims who do not fit within the paradigm of their future state. So they lie basically in this gray area where politics, religion, and the use of advocacy or violence are difficult to essentially disentangle. And in summing up, under the cover of religious freedom, Hizb ut-Tahrir aims to undermine essentially human rights, the foundation of democracy, the rule of law, and also the equality of citizens, because under the future state of the Hizb ut-Tahrir, non-Muslims would basically account for, they would be considered dhimmis or second-class citizens. And at the same time, they sought to overthrow governments, some of which have been elected in free and fair election, and to destroy essentially the international order that is currently in existence. As Emmanuel rightly mentioned, the group works outside the political system and do not involve itself in electoral politics and so on, although there has been cases in which they do it in places like Jordan. I mean, I thought that it's just interesting to note that the massive contradiction between the use of the master frame of human rights and the actual belief of the group with regards to human rights issues. I'm going to end there, and perhaps we can open it up to discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nawab. Last but not least, Enrica Fei, who will be talking about Bahrain, is it not? Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Enrica Fei. Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm a PhD candidate at the Institute of Arab Islamic Studies of the University of Exeter. And the plan was that I would talk about Iraq, which is the main focus of my PhD, where I look at the role of Iraq in the Shia transnational networks post-2003. But then we were in Brisbane for the IPSA Congress with Mohamed, and we had a very good panel on sectarianism. I presented there on Bahrain, and given the overall focus of this panel, I thought that this project by the side that I have with Bahrain was kind of working perhaps better. So I'm going to share it with you. So what are my goals today with this presentation? Today I will use the case of Bahrain, and to be precise, the case of Al-Wifaq, which is the main Shia Islamist, sorry, I forgot to, yeah, political society in Bahrain, to argue how Islamist parties may actually have an issue-based agenda rather than an identity-based one. How their discourse and their action is defined by the contentious politics of their own country rather than anything else. They therefore push for, in current times, for human and civil rights, like the previous speakers have argued, and Emmanuel has elaborated in his book. They are not necessarily exclusivist, as in making the interest of their own sect. And most importantly, they do not necessarily push for the implementation of an Islamist rule, although they are depicted as such, and their depiction, such a depiction, then ends up like kind of modeling their agenda. I will therefore, thanks to this, deconstruct the common reading of Islamist action in the Middle East, which tends to emphasize the sectarian strive, the sectarian element of these groups, both in the sense of like a sectarian agenda, but also in the sectarian struggle that then they have to face in the, opposing their regimes. And to show this in the case of Bahrain, I will conceptualize the state-society relations in the kingdom through the application of the theory of systems back to the 60s, which gives, I would argue, significant insights on at the local level in the case of Bahrain. And also to look at the case of Bahrain from an international and regional perspective, I will use the model of the regional security complex, a more recent one. Finally, I will share with you my sort of postulation of Iranian perceived deterrence capabilities, which I think gives quite significant insights in understanding the case of Bahrain, but also the dynamics at play in the wider region of the Gulf. In terms of methodology, you can see me here in some photos, like exploring Bahrain, as of course I relied on the existing literature, primary sources, especially from the British administration, to look at ancient Bahrain, then international and local media, and then mostly I basically conducted interviews in 2016 and 2017 in the context of my PhD fieldwork with Shia activists, Shia politicians from the Al-Wifaq, clergy, academics, and Shia youth. So, as you certainly all know, in 2011, thousands took the streets in Bahrain asking for social and political reforms, rule of law, human and civil rights, and that has resulted in an extremely violent and brutal repression from the side of the regime and the royal family of the Al Khalifa. The accusation has been the usual one when it comes to the Shia opposition in Bahrain, and that has been the Iranian involvement, being Iranian-backed and so on. That has resulted in the recent closure of the main Shia opposition group party also in Bahrain, which is Al-Wifaq. Recently, they've also, like the ex-leaders of Al-Wifaq, have been banned from politics, so they can't basically run for elections again. And then also, like the Sheikh Isa Qasim has had his citizenship revoked. The ex-deputy secretary of Al-Wifaq, Ali Salman, has been jailed, and so on. The list continues. And the framework through which the contentious politics of Bahrain and the repression has been looked at, both from the international media or also local media, Western and Arab literature, academic literature, as well as also the diplomatic circles of the US, UK, and European administration, has been the majority Shia country ruled by Sunni minority, with Al-Wifaq representing the main Shia Islamist group. But basically, why does this discourse come from? I mean, why such a majority Shia country ruled by Sunni minority? I myself have got to admit that when I arrived in Bahrain, I was myself expecting to find that. Well, it would be counterfactual to argue that there is no discrimination against the Shias in Bahrain. There is indeed socio-political discrimination rather than religious, as in they're not really persecuted in their rituals as such. Rather, there is political underrepresentation in key government ministries. Shias are banned from any security agencies, including like the police force. Which also means that as there is a very substantial population of Shias in Bahrain, the regime needs to basically literally import people from elsewhere, like from Pakistan, other countries, because otherwise they can't really fill the ranks of their agencies. Uneven distribution of resources due to elite corruption, nepotism, unemployment, and that has also resulted in several waves of acute repression against the Shias, as we see now. And this dichotomy majority-minority comes from the fact that indeed the island of Bahrain was historically mostly like a Shia island, if you want to see it as such, as in it was part of basically was under the influence of the Persian Empire, and also at the time of the schism in Islam, the tribes who followed the future Shias basically would actually would be located in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. Then in 1783, a Sunni tribe from Central Arabia, from Najd, actually conquered the island. And that was the Al Khalifa, who are now like the ruling family, who actually imposed an incredibly like iniquitous system of domination, where they would imposing basically a feudal state system. So the Shias, the native, using like another framework, the indigenous population had to pay to work their own land, literally. And that has then, in a sense, has continued since, and this is quite a striking feature when you look at the history of Bahrain, resulting in talking with people, I really had the sense of a strong sense of alienation, estrangement from the ruling family. One could argue that is usually the case when you, like in regimes, in authoritarian states. We may want to discuss, because I don't want to lose too long on this, but I actually have my own reservations on this. I mean, I think in the case of Bahrain, this sense of estrangement, like alienation, is really strong. And it's not between different groups within society. So there is not like an identity-based sort of conflict within like societies, rather against the rulers, as in more like a conquered and subjects dichotomy, which is the reason why I found the theory of systems theory by Easton quite an interesting one, as the theory of systems basically looks at political system, also authoritarian ones, not only democratic, as developing a self-regulating organism. So it looks at it as a whole. And it argues that the function of political institutions is to respond to demands originating from the social environment. And when, in failing to provide satisfactory responses, the political system then undergo a process of change. This is quite interesting because in the case of Bahrain, you have a continuous failure in providing responses, but you have no change. So according to the theory of systems, there is basically no system at place. So in the case of Bahrain, really there is no integrated whole. A point that I would like to stress, because it also came up in the discussion that followed my presentation in Brisbane, is not that I'm not denying. Oh, what happened here? Sorry, yes. I'm not denying sectarianism. Here I've kind of made up this word sectarianist. I think that the problem when you attempt to use a different framework in contexts where there have been like a sectarian tensions is that you kind of encounter the challenge of using this framework of analysis, which requires a very deep analysis of the meaning, which, as Fanar has actually argued in an article of his, Sectarianism and these contents, hasn't been really done, I believe, by the existing literature on sectarianism. So much has been written on sectarianism. Well, what did we really mean? Considering that it's an issue that travels across individual, community, state society, political, it kind of touches upon very different levels of analysis. And it has a negative connotation. So, moreover, there is this dichotomy, which I think that kind of, it's not only between Sunni and Shia, and it's like identity-based, all identity-based conflicts kind of touch upon. That is that an identity as maybe either cultural, as in concerning beliefs and rights, practices, and also political. And in the Shia Sunni, that has become very strong. In Bahrain, I would argue that there is no cultural identity struggle in times of peace between society groups, as in groups within society. But there is a constant political identity struggle between the rulers and the subjects, the Shia subjects. And there may be, and there is at the time, in current times, a cultural identity struggle between also different groups in society, meaning the Bahraini society, which, however, has been, I would argue, politically pushed for. And there is good literature on this, on the sort of also, plan really sounds too much conspiracy-like, so I don't like it, but like sort of push from the side of the regime in that direction. And on this, 2 minutes, whoa. Anyway, so my argument is basically the main conflict driver of this is the alienation between, such an alienation I talked about, between the Al-Khalifa and the subjects. Now, I will go quite fast because I have 2 minutes. And very simply, basically, in the rhetoric of the Al-Khalifa, the perfect political tool to crush the opposition has been the Iranian interference. which represents a shared concern in the region. As the regional security complex argues, actors in a region are inseparable security-wise and have similar perceptions of threats and behavior. So the Al Khalifa, being dependent for a number of reasons on the Al Saud, are in a sense, on the one hand, compelled to oppose Iran, but it's also like quite a, I mean, it's in their interest to be. And the Iranian interference accusation represents for them a perfect political tool. What did I do? Okay. So, very simply, my postulation of Iran's perceived deterrence capabilities is that if we actually look at the Iranian involvement in Bahrain, which is equal to 0, of al-Wifaq in the context of the Arab Spring, and the actual capabilities of Iran to pose a threat to the Al Khalifa and the Al Saud, we remain to equal 0. As in, there are actually a number of constraints that Iran would need to overcome that makes its capabilities very, very little. However, in a region like the Gulf that is dominated by the game of threats, the game of perceptions, sorry, the perception of threat coming from Iran results in a perception of deterrence capabilities that, in a sense, Iran benefits from as a projection of power, which is the reason why all the accusations against Iran hasn't been really denied by Iran as such. The only involvement of Iran in the case of Bahrain we have evidence of, is media support, and also some very sporadic, bombastic declarations by some leaders, Iranian leaders, which in fact are quite consistent with this like sort of bombastically emphasizing a power that Iran actually would struggle to implement. So again, well, basically, very conclusion. I've kind of concluded, I think. So al-Wifaq has pushed for more like issue-based politics. There is no evidence of a Shia exclusivist agenda. Alienation between society and state, combined with this Iranian paranoia, has resulted in is actually the main core of the contentious politics of Bahrain. I would argue that international pressure on the Bahraini government needs to be done because the violation of human and civil rights in Bahrain has been massive, and which would encompass a more rational and objective approach towards Iran. Thank you very much, and sorry for having talked a little bit too long.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Enrica, and thank you to the other panelists.